Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Golding, who has been the statewide Chief Psychiatrist for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, otherwise known as CDCR. He's had this role since 2014. He has designed policies for approximately 35,000 mentally ill incarcerated patients, incorporating federal court mandates applicable to 35 institutions. He supported the development of transfer policies for patients during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a special challenge for prison populations. Dr. Golding is board certified in psychiatry by the American Board of Psychiatry. He earned his Doctor of Medicine from The Ohio State University in 1991. He is on what's known as the California Model Team, which is committed to transforming California prisons to be centers of healing and transformation. I met Michael Golding and his wife on the phone back in 2019, 2020, when we were participating in a landmark personal development program. They were in the course, and I was assigned to support them in doing their assignments and getting value from the course. And over the course of our discussions, Dr. Golding shared with me what he did for a living, which I found fascinating. You're the lead psychiatrist for the state of California prison system? Wow, that's cool. I was impressed with his commitment, his passion, and his enthusiasm for what is possible. And he reassured me that volunteering in a prison is safe and makes a huge difference, both for me and for the people I meet. He was so right. It's been life-changing for both me and my husband. In the past 18 months, we have spent close to 40 days in 13 different California state prisons, volunteering with 3 exceptional nonprofit organizations. I am exceedingly grateful to Dr. Golding for encouraging us to get involved. Please welcome Dr. Michael Golding.
Hi, everyone. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me and see my screen. Can someone nod? Yes. All right. Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. Oh, my goodness. This flattery has also inspired me, and maybe I'll get into that if we have a little bit of time a little bit later in some of the things that I say and do. But I first want to just very briefly relate to what Mr. Cunningham said, our first speaker. I'm just going to read some of this. He said something about bringing people together for something new to happen, which is letting us know that creativity and new possibilities are always possible. And the other thing, and then he said, he talked about how that led to movements to prevent child abuse, for example. And then our next speaker described just a horrible upbringing with a violent father who was using a hammer, for example, and experiencing shooting. And yet something different happened with that man who's now speaking before us. He transformed himself into a new beginning, a new possibility for change, something absolutely remarkable. And I think you'll see in just a minute that this talk very much echoes that, but a little bit from a medical perspective. I would like to talk with you today about the effect of psychological stress in the prison system. Now, I'm going to show you today that prison settings stress is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Sometimes making situations in our prisons very much like military combat zones. I say that metaphorically, but sometimes it's actual. And the mental and physical stress patterns that you see, both in our incarcerated patients and in our staff, in our corrections officer, very much resembles those of our combat veterans. Now, mental and physical stress exacts a toll on us, a significant toll. And we know from other areas of research, but also from people looking in prison situations, that it's not only mental illness rates that are much higher amongst our patients in prison and amongst our uh, officers, it's also physical illness, which is much higher. Now, if a culture can cause something to be worse because of violence and fighting, then a change in culture can also make something better, can't it? The issue is, do we know how to make those changes? And I'd like to suggest to you that we are starting to learn that, so much so that, in fact, we've actually done some studies in changing the workforce that actually are showing for the first time in scientific history that people can actually live longer and better by changing workforce. Now, that hasn't quite been demonstrated in prisons yet, but I think from the data that I'll show you, it can be inferred. I'll talk briefly a little bit later about the mechanism for some of the physical illness and death that occurs, but I just want to let you know for now that think about this. People who are incarcerated, as well as our prison officers, are much more likely to get post-traumatic stress disorder. What happens? Well, just like our previous speaker, horrible events happen, and particularly if they happen repeatedly, those horrible events create sort of a state of hypervigilance. It probably was initially biologically programmed for us to do that. So we're really carefully paying attention to everything to make sure no one, as our previous speaker said, disrespects us. Or otherwise we get very volatile, very angry, fearful, and upset. And that activates our fight or flight systems. All kinds of bad things happen. And I'll talk about that a bit later. But suffice to say, that increases rates of cancer by suppressing our immune system. It increases rates of cardiovascular death. And paradoxically, a little bit also like our previous speaker suggested, also leads people to engage in more risky behavior. And so rates of death are about 2 times normal also for people with post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's look for a moment, and this is a graph which has lots of references, but let me try to make it just visible so that you can kind of understand the whole thing. What I'm basically listing is a pattern of various sorts of mental illnesses and ranges from a number of studies. So this is for correctional officers. I could have done something very similar for our incarcerated people, but this is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is many times higher in the general population, about 6%. In the incarcerated population, there are various estimates, but and in our correctional officers, it can be 34 to 43%. Also, depression is much higher. Generalized anxiety disorder, substance use disorders are much higher, as you see if you compare the yellow, which represents the general population, and suicidal thoughts in the last year 5 times higher, 2.1% to 11%, for our correctional officers. So our correctional officers very much are acting like they're in a combat zone, and they're injured because of it. They periodically say they're twice as likely to report distress on their job. And our correctional officers, if you think about it, and you look at it, and there's like 3,000 people looked at in this study, are as likely or more likely to have post-traumatic stress disorder relative to those patients, relative to those of us in the outside world. Now, look at some of these statistics. The orange is our correctional officers, and the red is our military veterans, seriously injured, feared serious injury or death, seen or handled dead body. Did you know that 75% of our correctional officers are handling dead bodies? Seen someone seriously injured or killed, 85%. So in some sense, our prison systems are metaphorically like combat zones. But in other ways, in terms of the uh, in some actual situations, it's very much like combat zones, and these individuals actually are experiencing horrible rates of both mental illness and the physical sequelae of that. And just one more comparison: correctional officers, about 1 in 7 um, are suicidal, have suicidal ideation, whereas combat veterans, it's about 1 in 4. And this study, there are very few really good scientific studies of death outcomes in any field. But this was one from Florida. And I must say, I think this figure is a little bit exaggerated. They're saying that correctional and police officers die on average at 62-year-old, relative to the average death in Florida at 76-year-old. I don't think it's that much. I think they didn't properly control for things. But suffice to say, death rates are considerably higher. Now, I've been talking about correctional officers in combat zones. How about our mentally ill individuals? Again, resembles nothing like the population. 3 to 12 times rates of mental illness, from post-traumatic stress disorder to attention deficit disorder. Now, they say that attention deficit disorder is 25%. I'll bet you that it's much higher than that, than what the study found, because what they're probably not taking into account is so many of our guys are, just like the gentleman who spoke, he kind of like prepared this speech for me, are head injured. And what does head injury do? Head injury causes very frequently attentional difficulty. Very, very high rates of injury and death, very high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, amongst our female incarcerated individuals, 12 to 38%, whereas in the outside world, we're at 5.2%. So imagine a third of our women are running around with having been raped or abused and experiencing trauma and shaking and sweating on a regular basis. And of course, this has physical health outcomes. I'm not going to go into the details of this study, but it has been looked at. And prison is really bad. Combat zones are really bad for your health, needless to say. People are dying 1 to 2 years earlier for each year in prison up to for the first few years of prison. So people are losing 5, 10 years of their life from having been in prison. Okay. Now, I'm going to go through this very quickly. I love talking about the why, but we only have a 15-minute talk. So I'm not gonna bore you too much with the details. I'm a doctor after all. Give me a break. I think that will bore people. But what I will tell you is this. Post-traumatic stress disorder is really bad for you. You can imagine, if you just think about it for a second, this is a hyperactive fight or flight response, right? So if you have a hyperactive fight or flight response, what's happening to your blood vessels? Well, they're probably getting shrunk and dilated, shrunk and dilated. And what does that do to the wall, the delicate lining of the walls of the vessel? Why, it breaks it. And what happens when it breaks it? It exposes something called collagen. So the body thinks you're bleeding, but you're not really bleeding. This is in your heart. And it attaches platelets, which go inside the wall. And you can kind of see it here with my pointer. And then at some point, this wall breaks and you end up getting clots, right? And this causes strokes and heart attacks. And what about cancer? Why is cancer higher? Well, cancer, normally the body, your body actually has mutations of its DNA, which causes cancer all the time. What happens? Normally your natural killer cells and cytotoxic T lymphocytes, again, I could go into a lot of details about that and would love to, but we're not. The cancer cells will get recognized and killed, but if your immune system is suppressed, that won't happen. Furthermore, we have stimulatory neurotransmitters in the brain that actually kill cells. And there's a reason why people have trouble with their memory who have been exposed to chronic stress. Literally, their memory centers get destroyed and killed. Okay. Now, what can be done to help this? Some of the early studies, and I'll just go very quickly with this, say that something as small as giving people more control of their environment helps. What kind of control? Just control of, say, work hours. Control of their ability to being supported by family has been found to not only improve morale, but productivity as well. Okay? So in California, there is a large-scale effort to try to improve prison culture. And there are four pillars of this California model, and I'm just going to read for right now the first two of them. One is normalization. And what they say about that, and this is, again, this is what they're saying. And I'm going to give you my thoughts also from watching this in action. Normalization aims to bring life in prison as close as possible to life outside of prison. The more life in prison resembles life in the community, the easier it will be for people to transition and adjust to life in the community upon release. What is dynamic security? Dynamic security is an approach that promotes positive interactions between staff and incarcerated people through purposeful activities and professional, positive, and respectful communications. Now, if you go to one of our prisons that is starting to implement this, and I am specifically talking about an aspect of the prison in which we had a psychiatric hospital. They have these individuals that are part of what are called resource teams. Now, these are custodial officers. What do you notice when you see them? Why, they're walking up to people's cell doors. What are they doing? They're engaging in standard communication, but it goes far beyond that. Rather than following the standard prison schedule, what can these resource officers do? Well, if they plan together some type of activity with the incarcerated individual, they can decide to do something horribly radical. How about this? Go together and play ping pong together. Watch a movie together. Plant something together. What is that called? That's called developing normal human relationships. What happens when that happens? When the administrators give our corrections officers the opportunity to open cell doors as when people are part of resource teams, our correctional officers. What happens, and it's in a way it's obvious if you think about it, is other people notice. Who notices? Well, other correction officers and other of our patients, of our incarcerated individuals. What do they notice? Why, people are having a good time. They're enjoying themselves, right? Rather than following a strict set of rules, correctional officers and our patients are starting to form relationships. That's what relaxing the rules and allowing them to do this when they feel safe allows to happen. Now, it's extremely early data, but since this program was initiated, rates of self-harm went down literally 53%. That's huge. A huge difference. And it's a direct and immediate effect. There are two other aspects of the California model. One involves this trauma-informed organization, which understands that trauma is ubiquitous. The other is we're developing peer support programs where our incarcerated patients themselves can get appropriate job experience. Learning to do what? Learning to do what Mr. Todd explained to us, help fellow inmates. Do what? Adapt to prison, be comfortable in prison, and also do what? Get paid to do so, and also do what? Be able to put it on their resume. So they're being trained to help each other. And thus, when they go into the community, what's going to happen? They're going to help the community. Now, there are two more brief parts to this presentation I'll go through very quickly in the interest of time. First, I want to show you that it actually is possible. Nobody studied it in prisons, but it actually is possible to help our incarcerated individuals and our corrections officers. But this was done with IT officers, rather IT individuals, people in IT, and people who are involved with long-term care. And what they did is they instituted a program that allowed people to have workers to have more control of their environment. And this is a remarkable study. This just came out a year ago. But basically, it's showing that in terms of medical risk factors, things like diabetes, cholesterol level, blood pressure, body mass index, Actually, the sickest people gained up to 1 or 2 years expected in their life. Absolutely remarkable. Can you imagine that? Changing a culture and people get to live long. Finally, I want to talk about the Norway model, which is maybe the most advanced model I'm aware of. In the 1990s, they started making changes into their prison system. And what did they do? They were starting to work on this bottom up sort of cooperation where individuals, again, just in a sense, like the custodian, like our California model, the custodial office was allowed to take people out of their cells, were allowed to interact with them as normal human beings. I just want to show you something to inspire you. It is possible to change. What was their recidivism rate in the 1990s? About 65% returned within 2 years or 5 years in Norway. Right now, ours is about 70%. What happened by humanizing the environment, by normalizing the environment, by allowing our custodial officers to interact freely and fairly? Prison recidivism fell to 20% and 25%. And one final point I want to make. Remember, I told you that being in prison takes years off your life, maybe 1 or 2 years for each year incarcerated. What does it then mean to not have to be in prison as much? People are living healthier, happier, and better lives, right? Okay. Finally, I want to show you this. The United States incarcerates an awful lot of people. That's per rates per 100,000. That's relative to the rest of the world. We're like doing 600, 700 people per 100,000. It's huge. Do we need to make these changes? Do we need to help improve the culture in our prison? Absolutely, we do. How do we do that? We do what Miss Flattery is doing. We volunteer to visit our prisons. That's how we change things. We visit. We create a group, as Mr. Cunningham said. We create something new. And as Mr. Todd said, we go into our prisons and we improve things. Thank you very much. I really appreciate listening to me today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Golding. That was very informative. I'm a fan of the mind too. So your geek out moment, I was right there with you.
I'm sorry. If you want to talk later about the geek stuff, we can go through it in detail.
Yeah, but we'll do our own one-on-one Zoom.
Sometimes I just can't help myself. I can't help myself sometimes.
Awesome, awesome. Well, let's open it up to some questions. I'm sure there's people that got some burning questions right now to ask you. So we're going to go on and get that going right now. So let me see here. Let's see what we have. What questions do we have? You have some questions. Okay, so I have a question myself. In regards to the work that you've been doing, how many years have you guys been doing it? And are there additional partners that are involved with your research?
Thank you. Yeah, there are. I mean, in terms of the California model, that's been going on for as an idea in another form for like 3 or 4 years. But I would just say it's a good idea and it has incredible potential. We're very early on this, but notice how culture changes. We don't do it by beating people up, by forcing things or whatever. We do it in a voluntary way. What's going on? The officers, for example, in Norway, which was an example, what's going on? They are having more choices in terms of what they can do within reason. They're not going to let someone out who's going to try to, who they feel is going to try to kill them, but to play ping pong with people and to have fun with individuals. And so it takes time for a culture change to spread. You can't impose it. People need to find, and I'll borrow from a friend of mine, Miss Flattery, people need to find something that's workable, right? And for workability, it takes time. So we ask patience to get that workability going.
Awesome, awesome. All right, so to what extent is there a prison industrial complex that is resistant to the changes we are seeking?
I'm a little bit hesitant to comment given my position. I think that there are no doubt when you are trying to make major changes in anything, whether that's civil rights legislation, whether that's, respect for our gay and lesbian colleagues, it takes time. And I don't like vilifying people. After all, I want to show you that our correctional officers and our patients in prison, they have, except for very serious mental illness like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, they're they look physiologically rather similar. They're in combat situations. And by the way, I'm not trying to make a moral equivalent between a murderer and, and a correctional officer. I'm not, but we're all people, and underneath it all, we can all change and become better at what we do. So yes, there are forces, but we want to have them join us, right?
Yes.
We want whatever the prison industrial complex is to be working with us. They're not our enemies.
Yes. So are you doing things in California? Will this be in California prisons as well?
I think that I do work for the California prisons, and yes, people are making these changes in the California prisons, and it's very, very slow, but there's a highest level commitment in the state from our executives to make this work, and there are an awful lot of very well-intentioned, good people who are trying to improve things for us, and I think that over time it will. But I ask for your patience. If it doesn't seem like that immediately. I mean, you're starting at literally one unit or a couple units or 3 or 4 units, and you're watching correctional officers change things.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So are the stats available to us? Is there some places we can get some references to get more information?
Sure. If anyone's interested, please ask me for stats about things. In terms of data, specifically about the California model, I have information that there's some data that's going to be dropping within the next week or two publicly. I was hoping that I could get it out. If this talk had been put off like a month from now, I could use that data, but not quite yet. But any of the references that I'm using, I'm happy to share and just joyously share with all of you. And I really appreciate doing that and teaching. Please volunteer. I mean, can I just say, I'm going to say it one more time, and I'm going to geek out in just a slightly different way, in my humanistic way. I'm going to geek out. Please visit the prisons. Please volunteer, and visits go. You're not going to be in danger. People, they're actually safer environments than walking down, a street in a big city. There are officers all over the place. You're not going to get injured. Try it, experience it, visit. Meet with our guys and gals, help them.
Yes, yes, I concur with that. I go into prison every Sunday, and it's amazing by 30 minutes or 1 hour with these groups, the information and them feeling your presence literally changes their lives for months at a time. And I'm a witness from that personally. So thank you so much, Dr. Golding. We really appreciate everything. I'm going to be standing on pins and needles for that research and that data, so I can give me some popcorn and I can read it and geek out. Okay.
All right. In exchange for popcorn, you can have anything. Think it has a little caramel on it or something. Can you do me some caramel with my popcorn? Really?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. But thank you so much, sir. Appreciate you.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate you too.